All right, good evening, everyone. We're going to get started here now. First off, my name is Elsa. I'm from the White Bear Lake Historical Society, and I'll be helping host our talk this evening. We have Chris Rico here, who has been doing some work on archaeological sites, mostly literature research, so looking for what sites are existing in the area and what resources are there. So his presentation tonight will be talking about what he's found and some of the work that he's been doing for us. Some logistics, we have both the chat and the Q&A open for you. If anybody has any questions, you're more than welcome to put those in as we go, but we will have a dedicated Q&A section at the end of the presentation. We can talk about stuff that comes up then. In the meantime, I think I will hand it over to Chris if you want to get whatever you need to get started, and we'll go from there.
Perfect. Thanks, Elsa. I will get my screen set up here and then we can get going. All right. Thanks for joining us tonight, everyone. My name's Chris. As Elsa has already stated, I am an employee of Nino Cultural Consultants. We're a local Twin Cities-based cultural resource management firm. We were contracted earlier in the year by the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society to carry out a literature review and limited archaeological assessment of the White Bear Lake area. Primarily, as we understand it, meant to be used for local education initiatives and to identify future research opportunities. The focus of the literature review in this case was on pre-contact or indigenous contexts in the White Bear Lake area. So the review, it focused on those contexts while also identifying later historic or post-contact sites, but not necessarily going as in-depth on the research on those sites. Again, the focus is on education initiatives and public engagement in the White Bear Lake area. So the review identified 41 known archaeological sites in an area defined by the White Bear Lake Area School District and the Mahadimidai Area School District. 28 of those were associated with a Native American indigenous context. And what you're seeing tonight in tonight's presentation is sort of a personal idea of mine, separate from this larger report. And it would be, the idea was to provide an extra deliverable for the project beyond this kind of technical, while still public-facing report. As we'll probably get into a little bit tonight, archaeology is exciting, but can also be kind of a dense topic. So I wanted to put something together that could communicate the findings of the report in a little bit easier of a way, and also serve as a medium to support the kind of sharing and engagement with this information gained from the project. The full report was submitted to the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society last month. To my understanding, it will be made available to vested stakeholders, interested members of the public, sometime after June 1st. Additionally, this presentation, or the medium that I'm presenting in tonight, should become available on a publicly accessible website, probably the Historical Society's website, also at some point after June 1st, the near future, pending sharing and ownership logistics, as well as logistics with finishing up the overall project, which I believe I should sneak in there, is a legacy amendment funded project. We are greatly appreciative of the legacy amendment and the money provided to the public to invest in knowledge and projects and stories like this. Okay. So I wanted to title this presentation, The Land Remembers, and this is kind of a concept that I've come across a lot in Indigenous literature, kind of contrary to what we think of, archaeology. We think of artifacts and these grandiose kind of sites and expeditions and things like that. In reality, artifacts obviously do are a central part to pre-contact archaeology, but a lot of these people have been living in um, the larger continent of North America for tens of thousands of years, and thus uh, sort of tangible, holdable evidence of that past is hard to find because it's so expansive, or at least for deeper parts of that time. This phrase, the land remembers, is kind of a hearkening to, or a shout out to, just connecting with the land, as well as calling out, you know, features such as burials and sacred sites and things like that, which still, although we don't necessarily have a physical object that we can hold in our hands, these very permanent reminders of this past is still all over the land. Um, so getting into a little bit of kind of logistics, and I guess giving you a little bit of rundown on what the profession of archaeology looks like in the United States and in Minnesota. Um, it exists largely as a step in environmental regulatory processes, um, landscape development, things like that are its most common application. The industry didn't really become standardized until the National Historic Preservation Act, and even subsequent acts and amendments to that act afterwards until 1966. So it's a relatively, when you think about it, new, although the practice of archaeology has been around um, at least for throughout the 1900s. It's not until 1966 we start to, at least in America, see standards with the profession. So intensive study, or what I kind of refer to as academic archaeology, although we're all academic archaeologists, so we're all based in that kind of mode of research. This intense form of archaeology, maybe you think of DNA testing and pollen analysis and kind of looking at a microscope in a lab or something like that, is a rare um, kind of opportunity for anybody outside of a university or kind of academic archaeology setting, especially within our regulatory based setting where time and money is always short in supply. Um, so in that sort of compliance based environment, artifacts and archaeological sites tend to be made um, after their discovery or after their rediscovery, for all intents and purposes, unavailable to be further researched, or evidence of the site is usually or can be retained as property of the developer or the landowner. Um, and again, I just want to clarify what I mean by being unavailable for research is time and money demands for the larger cultural resource management industry, or like for the company I work for, prohibit us from sort of getting in depth in a lot of these things. So I always like to say that archaeology is based in um, archaeology is based in the guiding principles of identification and preservation. Identification to uh, obviously, you know, um, identify the site, pick it out, visualize it on the landscape, and then preserve it for future study because it is so difficult in the moment to get the resources necessary to do intensive analysis. More and more, a lot of these principles are turning towards non-invasive methods of research, especially in the context that we'll be talking about tonight when dealing with sacred sites, burials, indigenous contexts, and things like that. It really is more and more in working with indigenous nations and cultures, the preferred method of archaeology when dealing with sensitive areas like a burial or a secret site. This first image below is kind of an example of what a non-invasive kind of survey method might look like. This is a LiDAR image of downtown White Bear Lake, actually, if you can recognize it at all. But we can see, LiDAR is one of several different kinds of kind of visual technologies that we as archaeologists use to survey an area to look for signs of previous occupation or use. It can show us things like burial mounds. It can show us hidden roads or roads, maybe places, areas not, sort of off the beaten path, not well known about, and just is sort of like looking at the landscape with a different set of eyes, really. Um, and then a picture below that is this is already commonly used in our industry. It's really um, yeah, more often than you think, used method of identifying a site is called pedestrian survey or field walking. And this could be considered another non-invasive method where we scan the surface of plowed fields or tilled areas for remnants of artifacts or whole artifacts, which um, get quite easily churned up, at least more recently deposited, likely from the woodland period, um, somewhat into the archaic period. Um, this tillage churns those artifacts up, brings them to the surface for us to see and sort of make deductions off of. So that being said, we have, in terms of sort of my positionality within the larger world of archaeology, the CRM positionality, cultural resource management, we have a really fragmented kind of understanding when you think about it of the past. Although we still know an impressive amount, um, we are always finding new and more information with our current kind of methods in archaeology, but again, rarely afforded the time beyond what is allowed to identify a site and do initial identification. We're rarely afforded the time to do kind of meaningful in-depth analysis, as we'll see going forward with a lot of these sites in the White Bear Lake area. I'm sort of just prepping. I'm not trying to, yeah, I'm just prepping you guys for some of the results to come. Um, so lastly, archaeology is a science, like all sciences. It has many different intersections, and it also is affected by a great deal of variables, including worldview. Um, so I just want to clarify that one, archaeology, like any science, is open to reinterpretation, and every day, those sort of revelations or new interpretations, ways we used to think things worked, are slowly and ever so slightly being revised as we get more information and we get a clearer picture. I just want to stress that because the focus of this project was on indigenous culture, indigenous past history in Minnesota, that our approach was a Western informed approach to interpreting the past. Archaeology is a Western informed approach to interpreting the past, and is only one way of doing so among a universe of ways of knowing. And again, like any science, current archaeological understandings should not be understood in a monolithic sense, as they're subject to change as we get new pieces of the picture and make new discoveries and advance in ways that we study the past. It's also extremely important for me to acknowledge that historically, archaeology and its intersections with biological and natural sciences have been used to support the systemic erasure of indigenous knowledge and history, and has caused immense physical and spiritual harm in that pursuit, as I am sure and hope we're all aware of that at least somewhat aware of that kind of history, whether it be in an archaeological context or the a colonial context. Indigenous histories of North America have always and continue to state that they have resided within these homelands since time immemorial, or as long as time can remember. And every day, to my last point, new archaeological discoveries, reexamination of existing evidence, and the changes in the way that we look at the past and look at ourselves provide additional support to that already legitimate knowledge. Since this is a Western informed kind of understanding of archaeology and in the history of Minnesota, I wanted to make sure that I linked. And again, hopefully you'll be able to follow some of these links when this application becomes available later on. For now, I can tell you, if you Google any one of the 11 Native nations that we share Minnesota with, you'll find their website, and each and every one of them has a tribal history section in that website. And I encourage everyone to engage with those histories and learn more about the people who lived here in the past and still live here today, right? Indigenous people never left. They never went anywhere. They've always been here, and they are still here today. Lastly, I do want to, hopefully I can put this in the chat. Encourage you all to just check out this website that I just shared in the chat. It's a really, it's something I use a lot in this project in kind of coming up with some of my interpretations and things like that based on the artifacts that we find in White Bear Lake, based, using that resource that I just shared in the chat to connect different cultures, different peoples, sometimes from hundreds, if not thousands of miles away here to the White Bear Lake area. So as I said before, 41 known archaeological sites were identified and reviewed for the study. 27, you'll notice some of these different marks on the map here have letters instead of numbers. And I also want to say just one other thing about these sort of locations. These are purposefully obscured or not in any kind of precise location in order to protect the and respect the resources or the sites themselves. So 27 of these sites have official numbers. The remainder are given letters and what are called, or what we refer to as, alpha sites. The numbered sites or official sites, the number just means, in a simple sense, that that site has received systematic study or analysis in the field by a trained professional archaeologist and has been, and the sort of intact in-ground evidence of human use or occupation was confirmed during that survey or that work by that archaeologist. An alpha site is a location which probably or did have that archaeological evidence, but has not received a formal evaluation in the form of archaeological fieldwork. So that would, that could be anything from a local informant or a local kind of legend, if you will, or rumor, to a published historical kind of narrative of an area or history of an area. Again, 28 of the 41 known archaeological sites in the White Bear Lake area are associated with an indigenous context and represent a span of history in the state from around 14,000 BCE, before Common Era, and continuing to today. Again, Native people are still here. And then just to emphasize that point, Marlena Miles is a Dakota artist. I love sharing her work. This is a sort of counter map or a modern remapping of the Twin Cities area through Dakota eyes, with Dakota place names and Dakota areas of significance. Um, Again, hopefully this will be available to you to kind of explore yourself sooner than later. Until then, if you just do a simple Google of Marlena Miles or Dakota land map, it should pop up as the first result. And it is really worth your time exploring, I promise. Um, so that being said, we're going to get into what I was kind of talking about can be a little bit more of the thick part of archaeology, especially in terms of um, uh, periods in the deep past, periods, um, again, kind of pointing to this periods of time, longer than time can remember. Periods usually past or before the woodland period, where oral tradition or historical primary sources um, start to thin out or not exist in the case of primary source documents. Um, so to kind of make up for that lack of um, work that's already been done in terms of the historical narrative or historical knowledge, archaeologists base a lot of their theories and practices about or concerning periods of time before the recent past on quantitative data in order to generate qualitative data or observations related to the peoples who lived and passed through the area prior to recent memory. So actually, and this often comes in the form of environmental data sets, various environmental data sets, um, which have been used in more recent memory back in the 90s to develop a system of kind of dividing the state into different archaeo-environmental regions. Um, and again, emphasizing that environmental history, environmental science is a huge part of archaeology in Minnesota and the CRM setting, and typically given as much, if not more, attention than physical sites or the artifacts themselves. Again, because these are such deep periods of time, it is so difficult to to rediscover them, and also, as we will soon find out, the environmental history or knowledge of the environment of the pre-contact world um, also tells us why um, sites of this deeper period are more difficult to find. Um, so again, Minnesota is divided into these different archaeo-environmental regions, and this is a form of taking, again, quantitative data and turning it into qualitative data. We're taking information on temperature, soil conditions, things like that. We're making regional associations out of those observations, and then based on that, um, these regions help us kind of know what to expect when we're going into an area if we don't already, if we're kind of going into an area blind, or doing kind of a true survey looking for something that we don't already know is there or assume is there. Again, these regions help us know where to look and expect what to find, turning quantitative data into qualitative data. So we know, based on this, just after about 10,000 BCE, before Common Era, the average temperature in Minnesota was around 0 degrees in January and 73 degrees in July, which seems, it's 10 to 20 degrees colder than our current average. Doesn't seem that much, less or more mild than current. But this is actually representative of a hugely drastic warming period in the environment of Minnesota during this time. Minnesota would have, prior to this time, been mostly covered by ice and tundra, only to rapidly, and we'll see this in just a second, develop into a large mixed spruce parkland biome, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying or an area characterized by spruce forest, ash, coniferous trees, some grasslands in between. Um, so this, if you can kind of picture the early Paleo-Indian environment as um, not the most friendly, I guess. Um, the environmental changes which characterize its later half um, translate to a growing yet still sparse distribution of resources in Minnesota, resources being things like food, but also things like um, materials for tools, etc. But anyway, leading to a sparse distribution of resources, this kind of changing but still harsh environment leading to that. Uh, so based on that, again, kind of quantitative information, we're able to make a qualitative deduction or observation or what have you on people's living during this time would likely not be sedentary. They wouldn't be staying in the same place for long periods of time because the land could not support that for themselves or for the resources that they were in search of. Things like wild game, wild animals, and things like that would be moving from place to place as the forage or food resources, as they exhaust those resources in an area, they would sort of be in a perpetual migration pattern, and then hence followed by the people living during that time as they would rely on them, on those animals for their food. In addition to um, foraging and of different resources, but mostly, again, because we know, going back to this kind of distribution of resources, we know game animals are just the most accessible pretty much um, during the time. And then so we did identify one site which could be associated with the archaic period in the study area. But I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself in my narrative. I'm focusing here on this part of the presentation to say that we know where White Bear Lake area is in the Central Lakes deciduous region. We know that this area is conducive to things like agriculture. It's conducive to a rich kind of flora environment or plant environment, and thus rich in a faunal or animals. So we know that based on this information that the White Bear Lake area 10,000, 11,000, 12,000 years ago would have been well suited to this kind of these lifeways common in the time period. And later when we get to the woodland period, which is largely what these regions are based off of, we know also well suited to eventually semi-permanent village settlements, which become common by the late woodland period, early settlement period. And you'll notice just some questions kind of posed here. Again, the idea is that this would be a public, this presentation itself, or the medium of this presentation, is hopefully going to be a public resource. These questions are meant as discussion questions to get people sort of thinking. That being said, this question here, how did groups of people live in the pre-contact past, and what evidence do archaeologists use to make those conclusions? I've already gone in a good deal into sort of things like environmental data and things like that that we use to make our deductions about the past. Now we can talk a little bit about the physical objects that are representative of that past that we have uncovered in various contexts across the state. So again, archaeologists traditionally recognize The pre-contact culture of Minnesota is spanning from 14,000 BCE to the arrival of Europeans in the state around 1680 or 344 years ago. That span of roughly 16,000 years is condensed into four periods, four larger periods by archaeologists, um, which have been given dates and associations specific to Minnesota by Minnesota researchers and archaeologists. Overall, the Paleo-Indian period spans a time from 14,000 BCE to 10,000 BCE. We know, again, it's situated towards the last glacial episode known as the Wisconsin episode. It's a rapid transition from this kind of cold, harsh living condition to a more temperate climate, though cold and snowfall is still abundant, making, again, although we characterize this as a drastic change or a gradual change in the environment, a better way to put it is it's a gradual change in the environment taking a great amount of time. So resources are still sparsely distributed during this time, even though they're growing. And then this is also kind of an interesting point of discussion in or point of knowledge for you all and sort of discussion in the profession of archaeology, especially in the state of Minnesota, where a really nice statistic here. I think it's something like, yeah, we have 15,000 numbered archaeological sites within Minnesota, or 15,000 known archaeological sites within Minnesota. Less than 100 of those 15,000 are listed with Paleo-Indian associations or otherwise. Another way of saying that is we know or we are pretty sure that these come from the Paleo-Indian period. Only 100 out of 15,000, and only two of those last that we know of have received verified carbon-14 dates or have received a kind of verified form of analysis, which again allows us to not definitively know, but narrow down the time period that it's coming from based on things like burnt organic material, etc. I won't get into the details of that too much. The Bradbury Brook site is one of these sites to be dated using carbon-14. It's near Lake Mille Lacs, and it's the oldest site in Minnesota, dated to around 8,000 BCE, which might be a point of kind of confusion for some, and it definitely is for archaeologists like me too. Kind of going back to what is interesting about this time period is because we know we have such little existing evidence to compare against, and the evidence that does exist is very similar in terms of how an archaeologist might decide that an artifact is representative of a certain era. Could be anything from the material it's made out of to the way that it is made. The late Paleo-Indian period and the early Archaic period, as we'll get into, are kind of blended together in Minnesota, and it's really difficult, again, because of the few sites that we know of and this blending of material type and manufacturing style. It's really difficult for us to differentiate between these two time periods, at least with this kind of simple artifact comparative artifact dating. And then just to illustrate this this is a difference of 500 years here in this map. Pardon the I was only able to get data from Minnesota on this stuff, so that's why you're not seeing the rest of this filled in. But this very short period of time, 500 years in the grand scheme of things, very short period of time. On the left, on the right, we have the kind of biome of Minnesota at 11,000 BCE, mostly glacial tundra and a kind of, again, the spruce coniferous grassland. Um, but only 500 years later, we have a huge diversification in the biomes in Minnesota. Only this top portion and over here, which actually isn't filled in, this is the only remaining tundra, we think, and this would be one of the only remaining kind of places of Minnesota still under glacial ice. Meanwhile, we have a boreal forest environment kind of coming in here in the southwest, and then birch, adler, pine species and forest biomes coming in the southwest here. And again, that spruce parkland, that spruce kind of grasslands and things like that slowly being pushed northward, and a nice big pocket of coniferous pine trees here in west central Minnesota. So again, just to illustrate the kind of, when you think about it, really amazing change in Minnesota's environmental history, just 500 years difference. So picking up on the Archaic period is recognized in Minnesota as spanning from around 9,500 before the Common Era to 500 years before the Common Era. In Minnesota, again, these are specific contexts. Minnesota, the Archaic period is marked with these continued changes in the climate, continued warming, and this brings with it new lakes, large lakes and rivers across the state with continuously rising temperatures. This helps diversify ecological resources available to those moving who might be moving through or now possibly living within the White Bear area or the state of Minnesota. And just kind of starting this, I'm just trying to paint a picture of this kind of snowball starting to roll downhill, if you will, really picking up in the Archaic period in terms of we're seeing, because this environment is becoming more hospitable and more resource rich, we're seeing a transition to new tool types. We're seeing a transition to completely new tool designs and new characteristics in those tools. Very characteristic of the Paleo-Indian period are these very elongated leaf-shaped blades, very meticulously and delicately crafted, high quality tools. Going down to the Archaic period, we see smaller tools, a little bit rougher, and we see the method of their attachment. It's difficult to see here, but these would have what is called a flute taken out of the artifacts. So the point could sit on a shaft or be hewn onto a shaft, sort of going in between, if you can picture, you know, a split of wood or what have you, a shaft, a tool, go in between that split or fit nicely on top and tied around, to seeing it, these tools being secured by these notches in the sides rather than those elongated flutes, and we'll get into why that is in just a second. So again, as this snowball is continuing to roll downhill, populations are growing in North America, and thus, you know, people don't need to follow these animals around as much as they used to, or they can become more dependent on foraging resources or aquatic resources like fish and things like that. We see that shift start to happen in the Archaic period because, again, a more conducive environment to those things. So these really high quality materials and environments, the reason that these are so, I say, meticulously crafted is because the quality of the material allows the people making these tools to create these intricate designs. The uh, material being really uh, of a single matrix, sort of pure, not having impurities in it, which would cause the material to shatter or break away at those points of impurity rather than where the crafter wants it to chip away. So again, this increase in population, this increase in resources leads to those niche materials used for creating those more meticulous points. They become harder to access. People aren't able to, you know, a lot of those materials are in very focused areas of the continent. Something like Knife River flint, a very common material in Minnesota, is only found in one part of North Dakota, several hundred miles away from us here. Um, it's a common material in the Paleo-Indian period because people are moving around so much. They're able to access that material, and there's less people um, in general to kind of compete for that resource. Coming to the middle or the later part of the Archaic period or the following period, increase in population, diversifying resources, things like that mean people are staying in a smaller area and becoming more guarded in the resources that area holds for them. So it's more difficult to access what is needed to make those more meticulous points. By the end of the period, we're seeing, and again, this is happening as well as in terms of large groundstone tools such as kind of choppers, mauls, hammerstones, happening throughout the Archaic period, especially becoming prevalent in the late, along with things like gouges or awls, picks, fishing equipment such as harpoons, hooks, and nets. Those are found in sites in central and eastern parts of Minnesota. And new materials in the use of tool production, such as bone and copper, are common by the late Archaic period. On the left here, we have an example of some copper fishing hooks and copper blades recovered from a site in Minnesota. Here, second from the left, is a side-notched projectile point. Again, this kind of material, this smaller design, and necessitated sort of design qualities by the material present in this. Second to the left, third to the, or second to the right here, and then these two, this final one all the way to the right, these shorter stems, and then again seeing the notching instead of fluting. So we were able to identify around 9 sites that have been associated with the Archaic period within the White Bear Lake area. Again, like Paleo-Indian sites, Archaic sites in Minnesota are difficult or more difficult to come by than later sites due to their earlier deposition. And additionally, again, because even though movement patterns are starting to get smaller, they are still comparatively large to later periods, sometimes continuing to take up thousands and thousands of square miles, for a territory or a range or a regular migrational pattern. People are leaving the evidence of their time in that place over much wider of an area rather than a concentrated area, thus making those things harder to come by. And again, this kind of snowball effect of the increase of density in people giving way to further competition for resource-rich areas. This again, this is all a positive feedback loop that then feeds into smaller um, smaller areas of occupation or smaller patterns of movement, which then turn into distinctive territories and further evolving, and continuously evolving um, identities and things like that of the people living in Minnesota or passing through Minnesota during the time. Um, and again, going back to this kind of how do we know that if we don't have necessarily if there's if the physical evidence is few and far between and kind of hard to find, how do we know what we know, or what, kind of what I'm saying is, again, going back to these different artifact styles and material types, and interesting kind of effect of the shrinking or the other materials becoming harder to access is that more local materials, materials like cherts and quartz, um, and things like that, I'm from just south of Hastings. It's pretty difficult for me to not find a nodule or a chunk of chert sitting around on the farm. It's just kind of, those lesser materials are just very easy to find, or don't require a lot of effort to find, compared to those higher quality resources, which require great distances of travel. Um, so the use of lesser but local materials rather than high quality materials, which are harder to find, um, gives us clues that tell us we're right, or we're on the right track in our thinking about migration patterns and population density and things like that during this time. Again, turning this idea of turning quantitative data into qualitative data or an observation. And then again, just to illustrate the kind of changing biome in Minnesota that is allowing all of this change to happen with it. Let's see, on the right, the biome at 8,000 years before Common Era, and then about 2,200 years later, something looking a little bit more like what we know of today, prairie, although still quite different. Prairie taking over most of the state, a boreal forest, a thin boreal forest strip towards the northeast corner of the state, and then thick coniferous or pine forests in the very tip of the state and spreading east. The woodland period spans a time from between picking up at the end of the Archaic period from 500 BCE to 1750 CE, or around the first time Europeans make their way into the state of Minnesota. The period for archaeologists is defined by we start to see things like pottery and the construction of mounds and effigy mounds, burial mounds and effigy mounds, within archaeological sites. And then one of the most terminal aspects of the woodland period is that we see a sharp increase in sedentary lifeways, or people aren't, put another way, people aren't traveling great distances anymore. They are still rooted in a sort of migrational seasonal lifeway, but it's much more condensed or much more local to the state rather than a whole region of the continent or the continent itself. And then again, this continues to feed into this positive feedback loop, this snowballing effect of increasing population means new technologies, advancing technologies, advancing ideas of identity and things like that. It all feeds into itself. So the early part of the period, of the woodland period, we see the climate start to reflect something of what we're more familiar with today. Populations in the state begin to rapidly expand. These new technologies emerge, such as ceramics, Um, and even with that brand new technology, we see a really rapid advance in its implementation and design through the woodland period itself, starting as sort of globular, thick-walled containers to very refined, thin-walled, tempered to increase the strength of the material with sand or shell, and with intricate designs put into the sidewalls. Um, and likewise with stone tools or lithic tool sets or other tool sets, we're seeing those become increasingly intricate, increasingly smaller, uniformly shaped, and finally, um, by the late or the end of the period, we see systematic agriculture in Minnesota and other, and as already existing in more southerly places of the continent. Agricultural systems such as the Three Sisters um, method of agriculture, maize, bean, and squash planting together. Um, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of a symbiotic relationship um, between the three, each helping the other in some way to grow. Also, we see wild rice being exploited across the state. Large village sites are common, or at least becoming comparatively common across central and southern Minnesota, especially in the Mille Lacs and lower Mississippi River region. Again, ceramics start to reflect more precise process of design. And finally, at the start of the period around the transition to the Common Era, we know that the Ojibwe or the Anishinaabe cultures began a sacred migration west from the East Coast in search of the place where food grows on water, or what we know today as Minnesota and the larger Great Lakes region. Um, and this is again sourced from Plugging White Earth website. Lots of ways to engage with these culturally informed histories of Minnesota and North America. These are some different artifacts typical of the woodland period. These are all from sites within the White Bear Lake area. Again, you can see this kind of smaller, uniformly shaped point. This is just an example here. The second from the left is a nice high quality blade made of Hickston sandstone. We'll get into what the kind of material types mean in just a second here. When we start talking about some of the sites specifically, we see some of these ceramics with the designing, and then again over here just a selection of artifacts showing these stones on the bottom, fire cracked rock. You know, people are using that to cook or heat water, and as well as the pottery, all indicative of a more localized lifestyle, sedentary lifestyle, village kind of lifestyle. And just a final kind of look at the woodland environment, very much in line with what we see with our kind of biomes in Minnesota today, a sort of border region in the east central part of the state, stretching down to the fringes of the southeast part of the state of this kind of oak boreal forest before transitioning to coniferous forest, pine trees, things like that in the north, and then prairie in the west and southwest. The late pre-contact and early contact is settlement period is a span of time from 1650 to 1850, more or less. This is kind of where archaeologists know kind of, or this is like, we know a lot about this time period because it's the most recently deposited in terms of artifacts, and we have a written record to go off of, as well as rich oral histories and things of that nature to give us clues about the past. So there was, and I forget if I mentioned this before, there were 16 woodland sites identified within the White Bear Lake area, again, reflecting this positive feedback loop I've been talking about of warming environment leads to increasing population. So we see more sites in the archaeological record because of that. People are more sedentary, so they're leaving their things in one places instead of scattered regionally, etc. So during the late woodland and early settlement periods, we know the study area would have primarily been utilized by groups of Metawakan Dakota living near the study area or near the White Bear Lake area, just a few miles southwest, mostly around the Mississippi, and further south around the Minnesota River region. By this time, being pushed from the Mille Lacs region of central and northern Minnesota, to kind of consolidate in the Mississippi and Minnesota River regions. So animals and forage resources would have been extremely abundant within the White Bear Lake area. These would include wild rice, animals like deer and beaver, all highly sought after for immediate and long-term food uses, utilitarian uses, shelter construction, tool and garment making, medicines, and so on and so on. With the introduction of the fur trade or the expansion of the fur trade into the state during the 17th and 18th century, or by about, I believe between 1650s and 1750s is when the fur trade starts to get into, or at least starts to poke into Minnesota. Those animals and those resources would be increasingly kind of swept up in the fervor of the fur trade at the time and utilized for their hides and furs, until the trades collapse when until the trades collapse. Other sources from for the fur trade of skins from deer, muskrat, mink, raccoon, those would have been increasingly utilized as things like deer, buffalo, larger animals, beaver, some more sought after animals. Those populations started to collapse from the fur trade itself, the overhunting generated by the loss of habitat to industrial agriculture and settlement. But again, the fur trade gives us a really good look at the connectivity that the White Bear Lake area provides for the larger kind of region. So thanks to its connectivity, regions surrounding the study area became well populated with trading posts representing different people and periods throughout the era, and further demonstrating again the overall importance and use of the White Bear Lake area as a connecting point. We'll get into that here next. Some of those posts include the American Fur Companies at Snake River and Mendota, the post of Maurice M. Samuel at Sunrise River. This would have been a direct kind of transit way to the Sunrise River, would have been a direct transit Sunrise River, Rice Creek River, direct transit way through the White Bear Lake area during the time, as well as those various traders established near Fort Snelling and along the Mississippi River. Additionally, we can see with the construction or the passing of the Minnesota Road Act in 1850, the Point Douglas St. Louis River Road, and the Point Douglas Fort Ripley Road, essentially Highway 61, or different parts of it, would sit at the east and west fringes of the study area or be established by 1858. And we know much of those roads were constructed over routes long traveled by, or footpaths long traveled by groups of Dakota and Ojibwe passing through or using the region as a connecting point. Fur traders like Pierre Radisson have given us kind of primary looks or primary source looks into the White Bear Lake area. Prior to the fur trade coming in, regularly we see fur traders regularly talking about groups of Ojibwe and Dakota in the area participating in each other's religious ceremonies. intermarrying and having generally friendly relations. Um, William Warren, an Ojibwe historian from the 19th century, also cites Ojibwe oral tradition, when speaking to cooperation between Dakota and Ojibwe during the time leading up to the fur trade, or the early fur trade, I'm sorry. Um, uh, Other researchers would suggest that the fur trade itself accounted for the kind of friendly relations between Dakota and Ojibwe people in the beginning um, of the era. They attribute that to Dakota wanting access to French fur trading, which Ojibwe, um, to French fur trade routes, which Ojibwe had already established at Sault Ste. Marie and areas in Wisconsin. Um, However, so basically, some researchers say that the relations were so good because the Dakota needed the Ojibwe to kind of act as a middleman or a middle person to mediate trade between them and the French. But upon the French uh, establishing a fort at Lake Pepin in southern Minnesota, this constitutes kind of a direct line of trade with the Dakota, and they no longer need Ojibwe to kind of mediate that trade. So they become much more, prior to this point, they were very welcoming of Ojibwe coming into the state um, and to complement those trade relations. After that, some people would suggest that Dakota became more guarded of territories in Minnesota, and that's where we start to see um, some of the tensions between the two. In actuality, I think that there um, is truth to that, um, or how should I say this? It's not wrong, but I think more and more the fur trade actually is responsible for those at least disruption in lifeways and adding to the kind of tension between the two. The Treaty of 1825 in Minnesota sought to distinguish Ojibwe from Dakota Territory in order to kind of, up to this point, um, infighting and things like that was becoming a little bit more commonplace and not so conducive to the fur trade. Um, Settlers thought that by distinguishing Ojibwe from Dakota Territory, that they could tamper those disagreements. Um, but the introduction of that kind of differing concepts over ownership and things like that between Ojibwe and Dakota and in indigenous cultures, we know that saying the two, Ojibwe and Dakota were enemies or at total war with one another is not an accurate statement. They had yearly or seasonal peace treaties with each other, often over the White Bear Lake area, as that the Treaty of 1825 would disrupt ideas of kind of shared ownership of the resources or the right to of both Ojibwe and Dakota and other tribal nations or tribal peoples to exist in that land and utilize its resources. That kind of mutual understanding prior to the fur trade was disrupted by the fur trade and these treaties and fed into kind of along with these changing relationships in the trade itself, fed into these kind of negative relations that I think a lot of us think of. Still the most kind of consequential part of this era or this era of treaty making, yet certainly intended effect, would be giving the US or the US kind of adopting the legal right to eventually oversee the transfer of Ojibwe and Dakota land in the Midwest to US territory by later by later treaties, including the 1829 Treaty at Prairie du Chien, 1837 Treaty at Washington, and the 1851 treaties at Mendota. The 1837 treaty enabled the transfer of the White Bear Lake area to the U.S. And later treaties facilitated the forming of the Wisconsin and Minnesota territories, and ultimately fulfilling the sort of true purpose of that kind of first round or initial rounds of treaty making, establishing that legal right to oversee the transfer of land to the United States. And then we know again, we can make, again, qualitative observations or deductions about the White Bear Lake area in addition to the written historical record, just by looking at the way that different river corridors are sort of connected going through the area and then over here on the larger region. It's, we know rivers were sort of the highways of the pre-automobile era, especially, and White Bear Lake is just uniquely sort of positioned in between these two, the Mississippi on the west and the St. Croix on the east, with the Rice Creek and Sunrise Riverway sort of connecting those two larger transportation ways, as well as the larger transportation ways relied upon by the fur trade, the Snake River, the Kettle River, the Rum River, the Mississippi itself. This means that the White Bear Lake area, in addition to being this kind of hub of transportation for the fur trade, we can make pretty good deductions about prior to the fur trade, it would have been the same for the indigenous people living in the area. This would have been an area rich with resources and also in a prime location in terms of access to transportation. And now we'll just kind of briefly look at some sites, as I know I'm kind of rambling on and we're getting to the end of our time here. So I just wanted to kind of, a lot of the sites in the White Bear Lake area are sort of, I mean, they're all, I guess I don't know what I'm trying to say, but they're all of a similar function, right? Most of the sites are, you see the same types of patterns of behavior and things like that across different sites, especially these sites that are near rivers and lakes and things like that. This site 21 RAP, an alpha site near Willow Lake, sort of is a good reflection of this connecting point and this resource-rich area of White Bear Lake during the time. Many sites, including these over at Lake Vandis, these three sites, the Willow Lake site and others, all show signs of short-term use or camping, things like that, and which is an indicative of White Bear during this time kind of being an area again of resources. This particular site was designated because of the possibility of there being rice hulling pits, and then some lithic flake debris found at the site. They weren't able to, the researcher at the time was not able to confirm whether or not the features at the site were indeed ricing pits, and that's why it has an alpha site designation. But we can again get a look at, this researcher was able to speculate on how the river would have looked in the past. There wouldn't have been, rich fish resources, but the environment would have been very conducive to waterfowl and small mammals because of the wild rice. um, growing there. And again, the presence of the wild rice itself in the area being indicative of uh, seasonal sort of hunting and gathering grounds. Again, primarily for members of the Mdewakanton Dakota. Um, although larger areas or sort of more resource rich areas like Lake Vadnais or and again, these are this photo here is of several artifacts or a series of artifacts found from the Lake Vadnais area. On the top section here, this is various pottery fragments. We have some what looks like quartz lithic flaking debris up here. Perhaps that is a chert over there. And then on the bottom here, we have what is called fire cracked rock, which happens when a rock is superheated, either to cook or boil water or what have you, or as an effect of just being kind of a hearth ring when those rocks are exposed to a cold shock, they'll shatter and they'll take on kind of a distinct red color. And that's how archaeologists know that they're fire cracked rock. This is an example of a modern or a recreation sort of. Obviously, these practices are still prevalent. Traditional harvest methods are still prevalent across Minnesota today, and are a hugely important part of indigenous cultures to this day. This is an image of sort of continuing those practices and what a rice hulling pit might have looked like or did look like. Again, this would be used by people living during the time. The harvested wild rice would be poured. Some of it would be poured into the pit, and then what act would happen that was called dancing. I believe that's that is what they refer to as dancing the wild rice. Either that or that's when they're shaking the chaff out. But anyway, a person would stand or use their feet to kind of grind the chaff off of the wild rice kernel by putting it in the pit and working it with their feet. There is a grouping of several sites within the downtown White Bear Lake area or the Manitou Island or the Spirit Island area, all associated with, excuse me, associated with a nearby mortuary site, which was recorded during something called the Northwestern Archaeological Field Survey in the 1800s by a gentleman named T.H. Lewis. The records that I was able to access at the state archaeologist's office showed that early development episodes in White Bear's history impacted a significant number of the mounds contained within the mortuary site. A significant amount of artifacts were recovered from those mounds, including human remains and including what is, in addition to indigenous artifacts and remains, what is believed to be the remains of a Frenchman based on a musket pistol recovered with the remains. That is based on past speculation from a past archaeologist. And again, should be thought of as just that, speculation. To my knowledge, it has not been confirmed. So this kind of is indicative of this darker legacy for which I was sort of speaking to earlier in the presentation on the archaeological profession being complicit in the distribution of these artifacts to research or the Historical Society, the state capitol, meant to sort of be, you could say, ogled at or yeah. It is, I wasn't able to determine what happened exactly to the artifacts themselves that were turned in, but it's likely as they came from a sacred context or a burial context that they have been or are in the process of being repatriated, likely to the Dakota, who an MNHS researcher at the time involved in kind of giving context to these sites states that there's ample historical evidence to show that the Dakota lived around the White Bear Lake area from around 1600 at least until the 1850s. So it's very probable these burials were left by, or at least some of these burials were left by that tribe. And then again, when we get a chance, hopefully, to look at this product, a link to some of the different oral histories or legends of Manitou Island, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. One of the most significant, and I'll wrap up on this, one of the most significant series of sites or findings in my opinion, of this project has been the discovery or the rediscovery of the Iverson collection. And I say rediscovery because if anybody here works in museum collections or something to that effect, you know that things actually tend to get lost in collections, or at least figuratively lost, maybe forgotten about. I feel that that was the case with the Iverson collection. I was not aware of it, and the folks who I was working with at the Historical Society, to my knowledge, were not aware of it. This is a huge personal collection of artifacts, which represents, and this is the really cool thing about the collection, an important thing, is that it is representative of every period that we know of habitation in the state of Minnesota. There are artifacts which are or could be associated to the Paleo-Indian, Archaic, Woodland, and early settlement period throughout the collection. Although it was discovered early in the 2000s that some of the data of that collection, so the collection was turned into the Minnesota Historical Society, and then either the Historical Society or the Office of the State Archaeologist generated site numbers and locations based on some descriptions that were given with the collection. We found out in the early 2000s, another researcher is sort of calling that into question, the locations of those sites, which presents, which I'll want to end with, a ripe opportunity for research to happen with this collection and to learn more about the White Bear Lake area. So the re-examination of those artifacts could provide a lot more context for the periods that I've been talking about tonight than I've been able to give you, or that really is easily accessible or exists at all, or exists in an accessible format. Researching this collection could provide a lot of information on the people living in the White Bear Lake area prior to European settlement, and including, there's quite a bit of speculation going back to some of the oral tradition of surrounding the White Bear Lake area. So traditional Dakota place names, including Otonwe Wakpadan, meaning village on a small river, is right here. This is around the area of, and this is a Nicollet, 1843 Nicollet map. This is around the area of what is today White Bear Lake, as well as Otonwe River. This is the Rice Creek River. Those translating to village on a small river, and Otonwe River also, Otonwe meaning village or village on a small river. Again, going back to the presence of mortuary sites and burial mounds in the lower, well, across the study area, but in downtown White Bear Lake, we know, based on Dakota tradition, as well as the locations of existing sites relative to burial mounds, that often a village would not be too far from burial mounds or vice versa. So again, going back to the Iverson collection, looking into this or doing further research on this existing resource, which is publicly accessible at MNHS, provides a really ripe opportunity to learn, in my opinion, far more valuable information, potentially, of course, than going in search of new information. And then just touching very briefly, I did want to touch a little bit just to tie everything kind of together. We did review historical or post-contact sites within the White Bear Lake area as well. And we're able to provide some information, some basic information, including citations and site numbers and things like that for future researchers to work with. But the focus was not on those sites for this particular project. So just a really basic kind of write-up or kind of condensing those sites. The most interesting of them are a series of shipwrecks within the White Bear Lake lake bed that were discovered or rediscovered in the 2010s. This survey utilized sonar and radar imagery to document the possibility of shipwrecks. Obviously, we know that they were able to document 3 for sure. These have confirmed site numbers. In the case of this site in the middle of the lake here, researchers were able to actually tell a lot of really interesting information about those wrecks based on the producer of the hull that was discovered at the bottom of the lake, in addition to sediment buildup in the wreck's open hull, allowing them to know or deduce when it was when it sunk or when it was deposited. Most of the other, like these pre-contact sites, all being similar in terms of resource gathering or short episodes of occupation. We see that similarly with post-contact and settlement period sites in the White Bear Lake area. There are several sort of ghost towns, and I say that with quotes because it's kind of an ambiguous term in the Office of the State Archaeologist, or at least in the designation of those. One of the ghost towns in reference is White Bear Lake itself. I don't know if you'd call that a ghost town, or maybe the early settlement of White Bear Lake you'd call a ghost town, but anyway, it's sort of an ambiguous term used to talk about early settlements. Several early settlements and historical farmsteads, in addition to these 3 shipwrecks we see here, and just kind of regular kind of settlement period use. What does it all mean? Just to put it very simply, and to illustrate it, White Bear Lake is a place of connection. It has been a place of connection for tens of thousands of years. This is a map I put together using the information from the link that I shared in the beginning of the talk on native territories. Again, this is not representative of any legal or what have you defined territory. This is simply meant as an example to kind of illustrate, one, how diverse and complex the societies were that existed prior to European settlement in North America and Minnesota, and the ways in which we can visualize their connections. We're able to come down to our, and it's kind of hard to tell with all of these. Let's see. So we can come down here to our Knife River Flint resource area, and then we see this this nice river, or this nice highway, connecting that resource region to sort of really the rest of the continent, but by way of river, Minnesota, and there obviously smaller tributaries extending to the Minnesota River could have been an alternate route as well. But when we find Knife River Flint at a site, such as several documented in the White Bear Lake area, we know it's coming from this area of North Dakota. And using this information or oral tradition or indigenous knowledge, we can then kind of get some ideas about who or what were the identities of the people interacting um, versus maybe people in Minnesota. Um, who were the people in Minnesota identifying themselves as in the late woodland period? Um, and who were they connecting with in the Knife River Flint area, vice versa? Um, for Burlington Shirt, another um, uh, exotic resource found in the White Bear Lake area at sites. Exotic meaning it only is formed in one place or is not local to Minnesota, and also Hickston silicified sandstone. But I've been doing a lot of talking and not left a lot of room for questions, which I apologize for. So I think I'm going to stop it there. Um, yeah.
Great, thank you, Chris. We have a couple questions already, but if you have any other questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A now. We'll try to go through a couple of them quickly before we let you guys go. First off, we have one from Sarah from earlier when you were talking about farming practices, and she asks if you could talk a little bit more about farming the three sisters, so the corn, beans, and squash, and are there native varieties that are still found in the area today, or how has the environment changed with that?
That is a really good question. Personally, I don't know a whole lot about if there are native varieties found in the White Bear Lake area today. My assumption, based on my farming background, is no. Um, Largely, or a lot of plants, especially ones we utilize a lot today, like corns, beans, and squash, have been sort of, and maybe this isn't the case with all of these, but engineered to not be able to reproduce in the wild or survive in the wild. Um, Heirloom varieties certainly still exist, although that's all, heirloom is also kind of a word that I don't really understand myself. But the Three Sisters sort of agriculture, um, I think is just it's something I learned about in sort of a survey or a canvas or kind of a light little hodgepodge of Minnesota, of everything Minnesota history. Um, and it's I think just an example I like to use of to kind of dispel any ideas of a less than or less advanced or what have you kind of lifeways or group of people existing before the settlement of Europeans. The Three Sisters agriculture is a very intentional, purposeful, and thought out way of performing agriculture. Um, they work in a symbiotic relationship. Like I said before, the beans climb the cornstalk, and the squash spreads out and keeping weeds and unwanted um, vegetation down.
Yeah, and then Lisa just put in the chat that Dream of Wild Health, which is an organization in Hugo, actually plants and saves a lot of these seeds. So they're a native-led organization too that has stuff. So for those who are interested in learning more about plants, you can check out the Dream of Wild Health website and stuff like that. And I'll throw
Thank you.
that link in the chat later as we go. We
Yeah,
have
that's
another question from, where did it go? Brad asking about if the size of the lake has changed over those thousands of years. Um, if you have a guess on what happened or any information on that.
another good question that unfortunately I don't even feel comfortable making a good sort of educated guess about, because I just don't know enough about um, kind of that portion of natural history. I want to say, well, what I can tell you is it was certainly more ecologically diverse. Um, as you can probably assume from me talking about wild rice and things like that being abundant within the White Bear Lake area. I'm not sure that it exists, at least as it once did, or naturally in the same way. Um, um, in the past.
Okay. And then we had another question about if you're going to cover the burial mounds, which we did a little bit. And there is more information on all of these sites specifically. in the report that we will share out with you hopefully pretty soon. And you'll all have access to this I guess website thing that Chris is going through today that you can read through and look at all this stuff. Do we have any other questions before we let anybody go?
It does look like Brad had a second part of their question about
Okay.
mounds on Lake Avenue, and I just want to quickly, yeah, address that I um, certainly this was a site that I would have identified in the survey. I purposely steered clear of speaking, or at least giving what I felt too much attention to desecration of sacred sites and things of that nature. In addition to it being whether still existent, partially existent, or non-existent, a sacred site. Um, uh, I just didn't feel it would be appropriate to um, go in depth into the research or conversation on that topic. Not to mention, um, there's just not a lot for me in the context of this report to be able to say on it.
All right. Well, if anyone has any other questions later on, you're more than welcome to contact us, the White Bear Lake Historical Society, with questions. We can help you answer them, or at least find a way to answer them. And yeah, thank you all very much for coming this evening, and thank you, Chris, so much for sharing all your work so far. As he's been saying, this is kind of a stepping off point, a good starting baseline for archaeology. So this is a place to start, and we can hopefully plan to go a little bit further in the future as we go. Again, if anyone has any questions later, please reach out to us. Thank you all very much for coming, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone.